a lot of people listen to these podcasts while they're driving, so I'll have to be very careful with the length and the volume. I don't want to cause any sort of despair on the M25 of anybody or anything, or think they've tuned the radio out.
National Grid was played on I think it was the Today programme on Radio 4 at
really?
8 o'clock in the morning in about 1999. And loads of people, including one of my relatives, heard it, and she said, "I nearly crashed the car." You know, so loud and so unexpected. A number of reports of people nearly crashing their car, and then it was also some tracks were played on a kind of community radio station in Brighton, and it crashed the transmitter.
But I feel like that's a massive achievement, is convincing the automated system that something's terrible's happened in the world and then it has to kind of kick in some kind of dead man switch or whatever. Yes, amazing. Well done. That's the peak of your career.
To a lot of people whose work is difficult to describe, and Joe Banks, who works as Disinformation, certainly falls into that category. The best I've come up with is poet of noise.
With National Grid, you get this very deep mains hum, and then I use guitar pedals to manipulate the sound. So you mix, for instance, the 50 hertz from mains hum. You can kind of like off-tune it slightly using the guitar pedal, so that you get the original mains hum mixed with a slightly sharp version of itself. So the sharp version might be 51 hertz. It's the same signal, but it's been shunted up a little bit. And the interaction between the two frequencies produces a rhythmic subbeat, so you get a sort of subbeat going. It goes from boom to sort of wom, 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 like that. This really, really deep rhythmic sound. Then you combine that with a sub-bass concert spec PA, and you've got something that sounds a bit like an earthquake. So it's if you do it right, it can be a very impressive kind of physical and even to some extent emotional experience for the audience. It's drama there. There's a sense of sort of drama, I suppose. You need a bit of a sense of theatre. So.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Joe Banks.
Yes. Yeah, nice to be here.
And yes, and it's been an absolute privilege to get you, and also welcome along my co-host Leila Johnston as well.
Hi, nice to be here, featuring on this amazing podcast. So it's a real honour, actually, genuinely.
Well, thank you. And a little bit about you, Joe, from what I understand, is that you've been described as a poet of noise on Channel 4 television. It
was actually Sky TV, that one, but yeah.
Oh, right, yeah, Sky TV. It is a trademark of mine to get a lot of things wrong very often, so not to worry about that at all. But so how did you end up on Sky TV having to explain yourself, Joe?
Yeah, I got in. Harry Kunzru was a writer on Mute magazine in the sort of early days of my project, which is called Disinformation, and I guess he kind of. See, I think I sent him a review copy of one of the early records I did in the post, and I don't know if it came about as a result of that, but anyway, he invited me to be interviewed on this show that he was doing for Sky TV. They were doing a kind of arts and culture program in about, I guess, 1999. And he came up with this statement, poet of noise, which sounds good,
It certainly does. And that should sit near. Well, I hope that stays on the T-shirt, because it's a very apt description of what you were doing. So
pretty much. Yeah, it was pretty spot on. That was. I'm not saying I'm the poet of noise per se, but I mean, that was the intention, was to find, stuff that was kind of exciting and interesting about material that previously people would have dismissed. So, hence noise.
Yeah. So how were you doing that? Were you sort of, you were capturing what we call, a very low frequency noise on recordings. Yeah. So how are you sort of harvesting them?
Well, it's actually it was really simple. That was one of the things that was kind of appealing and sort of fortunate about the whole kind of approach. I was kind of trying to make electronic music or ambient music with the cheapest means possible. How this actually came about in practice was that I saw in 1994 or 1995, there was a program on Channel 4 called Electric Skies, right? And they had this item about a phenomenon called the Schumann resonance, which is essentially a kind of electronic drone that can be picked up on very low frequency radio receivers. It's produced by the interaction between lightning and the Earth's magnetic field.
Every lightning is like a little radio antenna which transmits radio waves over a broad range of frequencies. It turns out the Earth is tuned in the Schumann resonance to one frequency. And just as you tune in a radio station on your radio, you can tune in the Schumann resonance at 8 cycles per second. And at that frequency, you can listen to effectively all the lightning on the planet.
It's this interesting phenomenon that just, I was sort of watching this documentary, I thought, right, that's drone music, So I went out the next day and didn't really know where to start with this kind of stuff. I got some copies of Shortwave magazine, which was at the time, I could guess pretty much the lowest in the kind of pecking order of kind of nerdery, Anyway, got some copies of Shortwave magazine from the local newsagent, and it referred to in the back issues, they had a series of articles from previous issues about radio science observation. So I ordered the back issues, and that's basically where most of the sort of repertoire of my early disinformation stuff came from, was from those 3 articles in Shortwave magazine, and they described, how you could build homebrew radio receivers for essentially, nearly zero budget. Simple astrophysics experiments and stuff like that. So on the one hand, you've got this extraordinary subject matter. On the other hand, there's very low cost and technical simplicity. So after I've been into this kind of thing for some time, I realized, for instance, that there's a whole literature and kind of enthusiast scene around recording radio setup that were much more accessible. So for instance, it turns out that there's this whole scene for enthusiasts who are involved in recording naturally occurring radio phenomena. There's a lot of literature about circuit designs and radios that you can build for that purpose. But in fact, it turned out after maybe a year of experimentation or something like that, I found out that you can essentially build a really good VLF broadband receiver just by taking any portable recording device and attaching an antenna to it, taking it outdoors at night as far away from power lines as possible, and attaching one side of if you sort of got the input socket, and you attach one wire from the input socket to a ground stake, which could literally just be a question of banging a stake in the ground and putting a kind of jump lead on it, and another side of the input socket to a crocodile clip, and putting the crocodile clip on a fence in the countryside at night. You can actually pick up sounds of stuff to do with the aurora and magnetic storms and lightning strikes bouncing around the Earth's magnetic field in space.
It's amazing.
Like
I love
so
that.
This is fascinating subject matter. To describe it as ambient music might be a bit of a stretch, but it's certainly comparable with wildlife recording, right? Which is an interesting field of artistic practice in its own right. One of the problems that arose with trying to sort of conduct these kind of experiments is you get mains hum all the time. Anything you do in this kind of field picks up loads of mains hum. And then after a while, it started to dawn on me that I could do stuff with mains hum. I borrowed a shortwave radio off a friend of mine. In fact, Mike Harding, he ran the record company that I was doing stuff with at the time, Ash International. And I got a little, from an advert in the back of Shortwave magazine, I got a little so-called VLF converter, which converts the shortwave radio to, doesn't work very well, but it converts the shortwave radio to pick up a very low frequency signal, and the VLF radio band is where you get most of the noise from sort of so-called atmospherics or naturally occurring radio signals. So I was able finally to record some atmospheric stuff, natural radio, but I also found that I could use the shortwave radio to not only pick up really loud signals from main tom, but also to kind of play them in the manner of a very crude musical instrument, because it's a sort of ring modulator circuit in the shortwave radio that's used for tuning Morse code. So if you were using a shortwave, say like on a ship at sea, to pick up Morse code, it might come in at kind of weird audio frequencies due to sort of modulation effects in the atmosphere. So there's this little button you can roll from left to right to sort of shunt it up or down in frequency so that you can actually hear it properly. And I could use that for getting the mains hum and then kind of playing it. And so I got this, and it's really distorted. So it sounds, you've got, first of all, mains hum is a musical note, right? So it's pretty much the lowest G on a piano keyboard. It's sort of slightly sharp, but mains hum is 50 hertz, and the lowest G on a piano keyboard is 49 hertz. So you've got this musical signal, and then you can use this so-called upper and lower sideband filter to actually play it like a kind of musical instrument. I actually did that in a few sort of concert performances. The first one was at a club called Disobey, 1996, and then I did one at the Royal College of Art and a place called the Lewisham Art House, David Land Art Centre, now closed down in Brighton, and a few other places like that. And it was pretty intense. It's really distorted, the signal, so it's got this ferocious kind of sound that's really kind of appropriate to the image. It's the notion of the sort of the sort of power of the national grid. There's this real kind of feeling of sort of ferocious energy. And then later on I started using just a mains transformer to achieve a similar effect, because it was basically the radio equipment. It's big, it's heavy, it's unreliable, it's difficult to get it to venues, it's difficult to get it to do the same thing for each performance every time. So then I started using a big old sort of laboratory power supply type thing that you'd have on the bench in the lab, and because that produces continuous output of unrectified mains alternating current, which is basically a musical note that goes doo like that, but really powerful. I found that I could feed that into some guitar pedals and get some really interesting effects.
When you were younger, was there any sort of like bits of tech that you were messing around with that was going to send you off down this path at all?
Yeah, I think with hindsight, there are some things that I did when I was a kid that sort of re-emerged later on in the disinformation repertoire. So, I wasn't, particularly computer literate or knowledgeable about electrical engineering or anything like that, but I had kind of messed around with electronics kits, torn apart old radios and TVs, not being able to put them back together again, stuff like that. And I got bored. My dad bought himself a train set on the pretense that it was for me.
Right, excellent. Yeah.
So he bought this train set, and it had a 12-volt AC alternating current transformer on it. So it wasn't a DC transformer; it's an alternating current transformer. And I got bored with the train set unscrewed the connectors on top of the transformer, wired it up to some loudspeakers that I nicked out of my granddad's dead radio that was in my dad's attic. I've got these ropey old loudspeakers, connected them up to the transformer, and it makes this sound like boom. It's an amazing sound.
Yeah.
These two speakers rocking up and down, sort of alternating up and down. And eventually smoke starts coming out the back of the loudspeakers, and there's a big bang, right?
I did that bit at the beginning of Back to the Future where he goes around the doc's house and wires up his guitar to the massive amplifier and everything falls over. Very much like that, I'm imagining. Yeah, amazing.
There's a scene in what's it called? The Blues Brothers, where they park it was a scene that was cut from Blues Brothers, so you find it on the special features of like the deleted scenes, where they park the car in the transformer station so that it can kind of like absorb by mystical power, some kind of magical process, absorb the power of the national grid or acquired kind of magical properties as a result of it. And it's kind of a bit like the shtick that I do.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was doing stuff in gallery installations, or I came to be doing stuff in gallery installations and performances, which was actually pretty similar to what I'd done as a kid. I was able to connect things like mains transformers or radios to bits and pieces of musical equipment. So, everybody in our kind of peer group or whatever was kind of messing around with music and stuff like that, but nobody really had the money to kind of buy fancy equipment. So you'd always be borrowing bits and pieces off your mate, So, with the that was basically what happened with National Grid. Is it's so like if you're an actual guitarist, you can pull out the jack lead from the guitar, and you put your thumb on the end of the lead, and it goes, and it's your body is acting as a kind of radio, and it attracts your body is acting as a kind of antenna, and it attracts a radio signal that's produced by mains hum, and it sort of injects it into the guitar lead. And some guitarists actually use that for tuning the bass guitar, because it's musically pure.
I always think it's interesting that it's like when you, I think we both know Sarah Anglis. You must know Sarah, yeah. But when she, when I've had, I've invited her to a few events that I've done, and she's played the theremin. And there's always a bit at the beginning where she has to tune the theremin to the room, and it's so interesting thinking about actually everyone's involved in the sound, it's sort of like lighting design, but for audio, isn't it? Everything in the room affects how things sound. It's something you don't really think about because it's not
I think the
visual culture
between sort of theremin type stuff and the kind of musical ideas that I've developed in the past is that the theremin requires a great deal of skill. Stuff that I do doesn't.
It's a different skill, I would say. I wouldn't put yourself down.
It requires a lot of imagination, but it doesn't require technical skill. So the kind of skill, if you're being kind to me, is in the process, in the details of the execution. She's got me, So she's a proper musician, and I'm not. Yeah.
I was listening to Sense, Data and Perception by your Disinformation project. What normally comes out of my speakers is something predictable in a rhythm. Yeah. What came out at this time was it was sort of like listening to things that you sort of like try and tune out in life, because I work with radio, and interference often causes problems in my day-to-day life. If I've got interference on a circuit, it causes problems for things. But actually to listen to the problems for pleasure was quite a juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, I remember sitting on the could it have been the Victoria line? I'm not sure. No, Bakerloo line, I think it was once, and there were two guys from London Underground chatting, a couple of seats away from me, saying, "What's your favourite? The sound of your favourite tune? What's your favourite underground line by sound?" Yeah, chosen by sound, I think.
Love that. Yeah.
I think it's most people agree that the Victoria line sounds the most horrible, I think. And I think they said that the Bakerloo line was their favourite one, but I should have taken some notes. But it's equivalent to that kind of thing. Sense, Data and Perception was a later Disinformation CD, and it was made by me remixing the earlier recordings. So I was taking that kind of stuff and making it a bit more musical. So weirdly, quite a lot of it actually has time signatures. It's kind of composed to an extent. I took these recordings of sort of what you might call pure noise and kind of chopped them up on a computer and reassembled them a bit like you would with techno, but with very different sounds,
It's not like, things like street photography and people taking kind of abstract pictures of the pavement and things like that sort of thing is quite popular, isn't it? And yet there isn't really a mainstream audio equivalent of people. In your world it probably seems like there is, but like for people who are used to the visual art world, I suppose, which is probably most people, it's quite hard to come across a lot of the similar sort of things to what you do. And it's a shame because we are constantly surrounded by sound. And one of my favourite things is this idea that there's so much in the world that is everything you're experiencing all the time is interesting. Like everything you walk down the street, there are so many things of interest that you can stop and think about for hours. But we're sort of just always on our little, obsessive little path to whatever we have to do next or whatever. But yeah, it seems a real shame that, and actually it makes me think of what you said about the nature, the sort of nature recordings aspect of it too, because it's a similar kind of thing. Like some people really pay attention to what's going on in the natural world, and it's really important to have those people. And similarly, I think it's really important to have people like you who are actually listening to the world.
When I was, the early days of the disinformation thing, so sort of 95, 96, 97, I was reading quite a lot about wildlife recording and some very interesting people. I think, for instance, Chris Watson's very well known. And there's a guy called Charlie Krause, I think, if memory serves, and there's a very interesting feature in Smithsonian magazine about the sort of ethics and philosophy of wildlife recording, if that doesn't sound too far-fetched. So, I was kind of influenced by some of those ideas at the time. And I guess what I was trying to do was do an urban equivalent of that. And I did think or hope, and to some extent I think I succeeded in, using these kind of sounds to communicate something about the nature of urban experience, that it's all on one level very, very claustrophobic, but on the other level sort of potentially somewhat sort of transcendent as well. You can sort of, relax into it and sort of rise with it. And, there's almost, I wouldn't want to overstate it, but there's almost a kind of psychedelic it's somewhat kind of an early review in the Wire magazine said made a connection between National Grid and trance techno, like acid house kind of sound, and that was very much part of the influence. Is that approach to having a really immersive, physical, strong physical vibration was very much influenced by acid house, and to slightly lesser extent by kind of dub reggae as well. I'd only ever been to one dub event, but it was pretty amazing. So that kind of thing, it was very much in my mind when I was doing that kind of stuff. Going to these acid house events in Brighton that were just kind of extraordinary physical experiences.
My first sort of like memory of someone terming VLF was in Common, sort of like on the radio was people were trying to weaponise VLF because it can create feelings of despair in people. Is this the same sort of thing that's causing a trance-like state in people who are listening to sort of like acid house or like a dub sort of thing?
Yeah, dunno is the answer. There's quite a lot in kind of there's a sort of almost new age circles about sort of frequencies of sound and radio and electromagnetic phenomena and things like that. I guess you call it kind of fringe science type stuff. And, some people believe there are sort of certain kind of magical frequencies, right? So, for instance, Schumann resonance often gets mentioned in that context as being the kind of sound of the earth sort of thing. It's not actually a sound per se, although it can produce one. I'm not convinced that these kind of phenomena really produce any very distinct physiological effects. VLF radio has been used a fair bit for military purposes, but it's for like communication with nuclear submarines and stuff like that. So VLF radio waves, by virtue of some of their physical properties, they can penetrate seawater. So to a shallow depth, that's not used as a weapon. There's a thing that received a lot of publicity in New Age circles and also on mainstream TV called HARP in Alaska, which was a military project, and it was to do with kind of using VLF, ELF type radio to kind of heat up the ionosphere, to sort of charge up the upper atmosphere with electricity. The purpose of it is some quite interesting physics involved was to actually, as far as I understand it, that would cause the ionosphere to physically expand as it got hotter and therefore come closer to the surface of the Earth. And the Americans thought that they could use this to improve the acuity of over the horizon radar that they were sending over the North Pole to try and see what was going on in Russia. There's some pretty interesting stuff going on there, but I'm not really convinced there's anything in this area that shows convincing evidence that there's really kind of like any kind of mind control or emotional or potential for kind of controlling people's emotions or thoughts or anything like that. I think it's pretty much an urban myth,
You've done some interesting sort of like been on your own voyage with I believe like a phenomenon called EVP as well.
EVP is a sort of field referred to as electronic voice phenomena research, whereby people who are interested in this think that they can use radios to record voices of ghosts, right? So this kind of follows on quite smoothly from the other stuff that I was doing with messing around with kind of cheap electronics and stuff and radio equipment and things like that. Because EVP demonstrations whereby you set up a typically quite a poor quality radio and then you tune its kind of random frequencies and then pick up distorted voices and then convince yourself that you're listening to, in some cases, literally your deceased ancestor. These demonstrations do sometimes work, and they can be quite convincing, especially, it's sad to say it, but especially if it's somebody who's recently bereaved and they really want to believe in this evidence. The underground music scene is sort of somewhat socially overlaps with the kind of, how to describe it, kind of alternative science type stuff. I've read an article in Scientific American magazine, which was written by a guy called Sean Carlson, and it described the work of an American psychoacoustician called Diana Deutsch. And she'd prepared these recordings of kind of ambiguous speech sounds. So they're like very, very garbled fragments of speech that have been assembled in a collage that kind of resembles avant-garde music, And when you listen to these recordings, you pretty reliably hear all kinds of random stuff, some of which either subtly or in some cases quite strongly resembles actual speech. But the nature of the speech varies with time. So you hear different things at different times, and it varies from person to person. So the material is exactly the same, but different people hear it as saying different things. And, this seemed to me to offer an explanation for EVP phenomena, whereby people record these distorted voices on radios and then listen to them over and over and over and over and over again and convince themselves that it's somebody actually talking to them, somebody from the afterlife talking to them. So I developed this project. The metaphor that sprung to mind straight away reading this article was like the Rorschach ink blot test, where you look at a symmetrical ink blot, and some people see a ghost, and some people see an angel, and some people see the face of a monster or something like that. So I developed this project. I started giving a talk under the title Rorschach Audio, whereby I played some EVP recordings, and then I played the Diana Deutsch recordings, and the audience can hear this stuff kind of happening to themselves in real time, and eventually developed that into quite a sort of involved research project, and wrote a book about it eventually as well. Despite my own initial skepticism, turned out to be very interesting.
Listen to the following sine wave speech sequence, then decide what meaning, if any, you think you can discern.
In psychic research, the emotional distance between the researcher and his subject is inevitably diminished until it is no more than the distance between any two persons. The acquiescence of the subject to the demands of the researcher becomes nothing more nor less than an individual act of faith, of love. If there can be no love between researcher and subject, there can be no experimentation.
Now listen to the original recording from which the sine wave speech you just heard was manufactured, as follows.
In psychic research, the emotional distance between the researcher and his subject is inevitably diminished until it is no more than the distance between any two persons. The acquiescence of the subject to the demands of the researcher becomes nothing more nor less than an individual act of faith, of love. If there can be no love between researcher and subject, there can be no experimentation.
Finally, listen to the sine wave speech sequence again.
In psychic research, the emotional distance between the researcher and his subject is inevitably diminished until it is no more than the distance between any two persons. The acquiescence of the subject to the demands of the researcher becomes nothing more nor less than an individual act of faith, of love. If there can be no love between researcher and subject, there can be no experimentation.
So, when you know what the original voice was actually saying, and then hear the sine wave speech version for the second time, most listeners report that much more vivid impressions of meaningful speech suddenly emerge from audio material that previously most listeners found almost unintelligible. Sine wave speech demonstrations help to illustrate the extent to which our expectations, and our prior knowledge, condition perceptions, in this case condition our perceptions in the auditory realm. The dialogue extract used in this demonstration is taken from the film, Stereo, by David Cronenberg.
On the EVP side, I think it's a lot to do with suggestion. Whenever they do an EVP recording, they're never doing one in Lakeside Shopping Centre, are they? They're always like in a churchyard or something like that. And that and whenever they pick anything up, it's never like it's never like a sonnet from Shakespeare. It's always like some doom laden phrase that's coming across.
I mean, psychologically, it also sort of overlaps somewhat with that whole backmasking thing where, the sort of right-wing evangelists in America were trying to discredit rock and roll by saying that, all these Satanists are sort of putting subliminal messages to brainwash our children, sort of thing, So the kind of imagery of EVP tends to kind of hook up with that so-called backmasking business to some extent. And of course, some publicity-hungry heavy metal musicians were delighted to oblige by putting real hidden messages in their music. They did quite
There is an overlap though in what you do, and I feel like you're a sort of EVP researcher, like not a spiritual one, but it's a similar kind of thing. You're bringing things from another world into the world of consciousness, or the world of our current hearing, or something like, or a cultural world, or something. You're pulling messages over from the other side somehow, a medium.
It's really, by the other side, it's really the subconscious, right?
Okay, yeah.
So I guess the sort of perspective that I developed is I sort of did a lot of reading about psychology of perception and got interested in auditory illusions, so how people mishear, stuff like this, and then visual illusions, sort of equivalent visual illusions. And, the mind basically operates through, it's bombarded with information all the time. There's far too much information for us to be able to sort of consciously process all of it all the time. So you both interpret and whittle down and make meaning out of and chuck out the junk by a sort of process of projection. And a better phrase is a process you use intelligent guesswork. And the phrase that's used in psychology is perceptual hypotheses. So hypothesis meaning guess, and you constantly project these perceptual hypotheses out into your environment to make sense of the information that's coming into your brain. But one of the things that's slightly counterintuitive about this is that you perceive all this guesswork as being reality, and that what you perceive as being reality is a sort of composite of all these guesses, and the guesses are almost always accurate. So you think you say it's guesswork, you think it would be wrong, but actually it's almost always right. So the edge of the table is where you think it is. The person you're talking to did actually say what you thought they said. So it's only under the brain is extremely good at sort of making plausible representations of the external world, assembling them from all these guesses. So you're only very occasionally aware of the illusory nature of this guesswork on the very rare occasions that it makes a mistake. And normally you get things right. So you perceive, reality as a kind of seamless illusion in a sense, but you're not aware of it being an illusion. So that's more or less brought to the fore with the Rorschach Audio Project, because that's the kind of propaganda point that I'm trying to make, is to sort of essentially inform people about psychology of perception. But it's also relevant with the disinformation stuff, which is more like pure art, because the subjective reactions that people have to, for instance, experiencing powerful sub-bass or something like that also come from the subconscious mind, so that's something that's very interesting. So one of the ideas I developed in the blurb for National Grid is that I used the phrase infant fetal hypnagogic sense memories, I think was the phrase I used, that it's literally like if you're in a dark room, like a pitch black exhibition space, and you hear this kind of like deep rumbling sound with a sort of rhythmic pulse in it. It's kind of like going back to the womb, It might sound a bit far-fetched, but this is actually a technique that's used with severely autistic people by kind of music therapy practitioners and stuff. So, I'm trying to kind of tap into something quite primal in the unconscious mind.
Could be that I'm sort of beginning to think that like these constant sounds of us, the VLF or the heartbeat or the rhythmic bass that you were explaining a moment ago about going back to your womb. I'm just wondering if it's like a dead man's handle in the effect that if it actually stopped happening, whatever it was, you would sort of like subliminally behave differently. You'd begin to panic in some way.
I mean, on a very subtle level, I think that's true, because, with, say, for instance, at Fabrica Gallery in Brighton in 2001, they ran National Grid for 5 weeks. So it was literally like never turned off for 5 weeks. And I did it in the Foundry sub-basement, this sort of bar and culture space in Hoxton, for 4 weeks. It wasn't switched on continuously for 4 weeks. And when you suddenly switch it off, you do kind of panic slightly, because you get so used to having this repetitive sound as part of your environment. You sort of absorb it into your sense of whatever, and then when it's gone, there's an immense sense of absence. You adjust to normality again in about 10 seconds. But yeah, that's definitely the case. And I mean, there is an argument that essentially most people have kind of tinnitus sounds in their nervous system all the time, but that we've learned to tune them out, and that can be demonstrated in some laboratory experiments. So in fact, weirdly, there is a kind of background noise going on all the time that we learn to ignore in our nervous system.
Have you ever been in one of those chambers? I forget what they're called, where they tune out all sound and you start to be able to hear your own blood and stuff. You know what I mean?
Chamber.
Yes.
Yeah, I have. It didn't really work for me because I've got mild tinnitus.
Well, did it work in the sense that it made the tinnitus seem a lot louder, or was there any effect at all?
You need to be able to hear total silence for it to work.
Right. Oh, that's a shame.
What Leila's referring to is that this. I don't know if he discovered it, but there's audiologist, psychologist called Pavel Jastrabov who found out that if you put people in an anechoic chamber, then they essentially all start to develop temporary tinnitus, and your sense of hearing becomes more acute, so you can hear your own heartbeat, and you can hear like Carl said, your own circulation, which can be quite alarming for some people. Some people really don't like it. It didn't work for me, but evidently it works for some people.
I really want to try it.
I mean, sadly, just before lockdown, I kind of applied for an artist residency type thing at the former British Telecom or Post Office research station at Martlesham Heath, where they had an anechoic chamber and lots of really interesting electronics, and they were going to close it down, in fact demolish it a couple of months after. They were just sort of this organisation was quickly trying to get this artist project in before they knocked it down. And then COVID came and I didn't get it.
Shame.
Martlesham would have been a lovely setting for it as well. It's got a very odd sort of like building that's spun at 45 degrees, one above the other. And I travel past it on the A12 quite often, so I know that I'm just past Ipswich on the way to somewhere else when I go past it. It's just a landmark for me. But it was like an iron lung for a lot of the people in the area to be employed there. That's for sure.
That's really interesting that you say that. Yeah. For listeners, it's worth looking up the. Can you remember what it's got? Was it Ad Astral House or something?
Yeah.
Worth looking it up on Google Images, because it was an extraordinary bit of sort of brutalist architecture. Really, really strange looking building.
Modern telephone exchanges, such as System X, offer the customer many new services. At the Post Office Research Centre at Martlesham Heath, a computer-controlled experimental exchange called Pathfinder incorporates several of these. A key feature of the services, such as alarm calls, call diversion, short code dialing, call barring, and repeat last call, is a series of recorded announcements to guide the user.
You have booked an alarm call for 600 hours. You have booked an alarm call.
At first, it's likely that users will wish to hear the complete announcements at each stage. But the practiced user can complete the operation sequence without waiting for prompts from the system.
You have booked an alarm call for 600
But
hours.
once an announcement has started, it's necessary to wait for its completion before dialing. We should stress that Pathfinder was built as a research tool. An announcement generator is a prototype of that to be used in System X exchanges. So the quality of the announcement is not representative of that to be used on System X. As in most applications of electronics technology, developments are rapid, and better methods of synthesizing and digitizing speech are becoming available. Two new buttons, a star and a square, have been added to the standard keypad. Short code dialing allows users to store frequently called numbers, including international numbers, against 1 or 2 digit codes. For example, here the Scottish motoring information number is being stored against short code 5.
Dial a short code followed by star. Dial the telephone number followed by a star if you want to record
I recently found out that because government buildings didn't need planning permission, they could just stick anything up where they liked. You've got some very poor examples of like architecture, probably made of the most fashionable building material of choice at the moment, racks somewhere in the middle of my local town, and then you've got absolute great art, monuments to brutalism in the middle of the countryside in Suffolk. So it's quite odd. And obviously the biggest official secret in the world, the Telecom Tower, it was all done because of they got blanket they got absolute immunity from planning permission.
That's really interesting.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I mean the Telecom Tower is really a sort of cultural landmark that's kind of underappreciated. Post Office Tower, Carl. My dad worked as a graphic designer for Post Office Telecommunications in the 60s. So he sort of started working in the 1960s, and they he wasn't a direct employee of Telecom, but he was contracted to, design typeface for them. So they had, I don't know if you know the double line lettering that they...
Yeah.
70s, which is... I've got a vested interest in saying this, but it's fantastic. It's really, really nice bit of typography. That was designed by my dad and his business partner.
Fantastic. What a great fact. I was going to ask you earlier what your parents did when you sort of talking about growing up, taking things apart and stuff. And but I wasn't expecting that. That's an excellent thing. Yeah.
My dad he wasn't involved in electronics at all, but he was a graphic designer. So there's this kind of mystical theory I have about art, that when people are looking for inspiration, they rack their brains looking for something interesting, and the kind of Zen fact is that usually what you find of like your life's destiny or whatever is what you've been sitting on all of your life without realizing it. The thing that you go out to look for is actually the thing that was always closest to home in the first place, but needed some kind of shift in perspective for you to realize what it was. So, really although he wasn't, say, an electrical engineer, interestingly, his brother was. My dad's brother passed away a few days ago. He was 102. And for years, he said that he worked for GCHQ, right? And for years, if you said to him, Eddie, what do you do for a living? He'd say, I'm an electrician. And he stuck to that for years and years and years and years and years. And then he started, although he worked for GCHQ, he helped MI6 and the CIA tunnel under the Berlin Wall and tap into these German telephone exchanges.
Oh, right. He was just a contractor.
Yeah. So he only found out about this when he read it, because it was all like information was only given over on a need-to-know basis. So he only found out that he'd been involved in this operation when he read about it in Spycatcher.
Amazing.
Not long before he died, he said that he's apparently said to my aunt Marjorie, he said, my dad's sister, he said that he'd helped Alan Turing build the first digital computer in Manchester in the 1950s.
Oh, the pilot ace.
Yeah, I have no reason to think that isn't true.
Amazing! Wow.
He was of that generation that thought you did actually have to, respect the Official Secrets Acts and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so Eddie was involved was an electrical engineer.
Yeah.
GCHQ. Dad was, although he wasn't an engineer, a lot of the stuff that they did with post office telecommunications was to do with electrical engineering. We had duplicates of a lot of his print material. So we being me and my mum, we kept this stuff, and I was trying to think of a way of sort of developing this as a kind of art project. And that's where this other recording that I made called Language as Metatechnology came from, because I was experimenting with his sort of graphic design materials. And basically this, to cut a long story short, this axiom that the ultimate form of communications technology is language itself kind of came from comparing his collection of books to do with history of printing, history of visual communication with subject matter that he was dealing with. At the time in the sort of late 60s, he was reading Marshall McLuhan and stuff like that. So that's kind of where all that came from.
The earliest form of sound recording technology was not a machine, but was written language. Language is metatechnology. Language is the technology that contains all others. The ultimate form of communications technology is language itself. Art is not necessarily science, but science is always art. All literature and poetry are forms of sonic art. All artworks are psychology experiments. Words themselves are weapons of sound. Quote, "The medium is not the message." speech itself is an art form.
Thing with that was to sort of coalesce and sort of propagandize to some extent, maybe people will hear the recording in this program, but somebody contacted me about that and they said it was a bit like a Maoist propaganda, the style of having this kind of like slightly kind of unnerving voice, sort of coming out with these kind of dictums or accents or whatever. But that was, although I wouldn't have used that language to describe it, that was completely deliberate. It's it's a work of propaganda, and part of the motivation for doing it, and for the content and for the form and the content of that project. There's so much fixation in society at the moment on people getting ahead through technology, but this idea that language is the technology that contains all others, the ultimate form of communications technology is language itself, is that in order to really benefit from technology and to get technology to work from you also need language skills. And to try and enthuse people about this notion that language is the earliest form of kind of really powerful, the earliest and most sophisticated tool that human society. Because in the arts, there's particularly in visual art, there's a lot of what you might call it might sound a bit far-fetched to say this, but it's kind of true. There's a lot of kind of anti-linguistic propaganda sort of coming out of sort of postmodernist theory and stuff like that, sort of suggesting that language is essentially completely meaningless, sort of variations on that kind of thing. Contrary-wise, language is in fact the most powerful tool that's ever been devised and placed at the disposal of human operators, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think one of the recorded dictats that I listened to was it the machine is not the message, or the machine is not the messenger.
Not the message, yeah. Marshall McLuhan came out with this famous thing that the medium is the message, and what he meant was, it's not obvious, is that if you were talking on the telephone, he came up with this in the 60s. The fact that you were using the telephone, the medium, was the message, because the fact that you were using it and therefore encouraging other people to engage with the medium was more important than what it is you actually said down the phone. And whilst I kind of agree with that to some extent, it's also very, very, so that sort of thought process has become highly influential in the arts. But from a political point of view, it's also important to remind people about content, particularly in the sort of era of disinformation. Disinformation is being weaponized by all the major powers in the world, and particularly by opportunists like Trump and Putin and people like that. I used to, I give these Rorschach audio talks, and I used to have a line in the talk about the interface between philosophy and electrical engineering, and you always get somebody who'd laugh when I said that, because it's just such a ridiculous idea that there can be any connection between philosophy and electrical engineering. And in fact, it's called information theory. It's one of the most powerful and almost defining ideas of the 20th century. There's a huge overlap between philosophy and electrical engineering.
Earlier on, you said about your earlier VLF work where you were using sort of like you were coupling one side up of a recording equipment maybe to a ground plane, and then the other part you were clipping onto a fence.
Yeah.
I've heard a similar story about that for people who can actually, they feel that they can hear music in their heads.
Yeah.
And it turns out, is it something to do with like the saliva and the filling in their mouths is creating a radio receiver?
I mean, that's. I think I'm right in saying that's the kind of story they would discuss it in things like Shortwave magazine or some of the earlier radio magazines from the 50s and 60s and stuff like that. I think that you've got a filling with metal in it, and then you've got a filling with ceramic and metal in close contact, it can behave electrically a bit like a transistor, and it can demodulate a radio signal. So weirdly, people, there's a sort of unfortunate overlap with sort of some mental health issues. That some people who say they're hearing voices in their head are not necessarily lying. I don't know, it's very, very, very rare with kind of spontaneous demodulation of radio signals. I mean, I've heard stories about bed frames, cranky old bed frames playing a radio signal and stuff like that. It's not completely implausible. There's a book, a fantastic old book I've got called Electro War by a guy called Kurt Doberer, I think he's called. And he talks about a radio station in Germany before the war, and the signal they were putting out was so powerful that people in allotments nearby were just hooking up a load of wire on poles across their allotment, making an antenna and powering lighting for their garden shed. Sort of like
Tesla
tapping sort of spare electricity from this big radio antenna. And there's another story about the BBC transmitter. Is it in Daventry? I think it's a big BBC transmitter station that also sends out stuff for nuclear submarines. And that if you were standing nearby one of these big big antennas that was sending out Morse code, the rivets are the eye holes on where you get the laces on the workers' boots would spark in time to the Morse key. Because there was just so much electricity that it would actually demodulate into the metal on their shoes.
That's incredible.
Produce a spark. And there is also the trick where you can get a fluorescent light bulb and just kind of like wave it around underneath a pylon at night, and you can see a glow inside the tube.
Scary, isn't it?
Phosphorescence.
And that's something that we did to kind of comic effect in some of our performances, because I used to perform National Grid as a public entertainment, and used to do that for a few years. And then my friend Mark Pilkington introduced some new ideas to do with using laboratory physics equipment. So if like National Grid is the baseline, then we had some kind of other instruments to play with as well. You see what I mean? Equivalent to guitars or something like that. And one of the things we do is kind of like use all this high voltage equipment and then wave fluorescent tubes around that were lighting up in our hands, which looks really dangerous.
It does look dangerous.
It's not that dangerous.
It's
quite fun, but, as an entertainment for the audience. It sounds worse than it was. I mean, it does hurt, but not very much.
That's it. So do you, in your performances, you use a lot of obsolete technology and repurposed equipment?
Yeah. The kind of secret weapon that we had in these National Grid performances was to accompany the bass drone with electrical noise from basically anything we could lay our hands on. So any old kind of old school physics lab, high voltage equipment. So I started going to scientific instruments fairs and buying, Victorian Wimshurst machines. High voltage static electricity generators. There are things you see in the Frankenstein films where you've got these spinning glass discs that produce very high voltage from some weird process. I don't know how it works. They produce very high voltages just kind of from the friction of the atmosphere almost.
So it's something out of H.G. Wells's universe by the sound of it.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of Frankenstein films. Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Sort of kind of comes to life. I mean, those scenes in the Frankenstein movies were actually quite similar to our performances. That we didn't have a dead body.
No, not at the beginning.
Reanimate.
That's good.
There's a lot of kind of obsolete laboratory equipment and obsolete medical equipment that we were using. which you could pick up relatively cheap.
I think it's like nowadays. It's kind of, I mean, it was that sort of cliche of kids today, or even millennials today, don't know that the save icon is actually a floppy disk and what that means. They're like, why is there a weird square? What's that supposed to be? But it's that thing of like, I just feel like I appreciate now that when I was a child, we had literally a metal coat hanger on the TV, and you would move it around, and there was like a physicality to it, and you could actually find the frequency with your hand. You know, there's something very like real about it.
The unfortunate paradox of that one was that, you know, people would unwind a coat hanger, wedge it in the aerial socket of the TV to improve the reception. So the coat hanger would kind of wobble, and then the picture would go off. You'd get up, walk across the room,
yeah,
and the picture would get better, and then you'd sit down.
Yes,
right.
That's right.
It was because when you touch the coat hanger, you actually become part of it.
Yeah.
The human body is mostly made out of water, so it's actually electrically conductive. So there's this big mass of sort of bag full of water essentially in your body that you know, there's all this radio signal, TV signal being absorbed by the body, and that's then injected into the antenna, and that improves the reception because you're actually becoming part of the antenna. When you sit back down on the sofa, then you've disconnected half of the antenna. In a weird catch-22 there.
It was always the apocryphal joke, isn't it, in the Morecambe and Wise sketches and things like that, when they were moving or it might have been Steptoe and Son, when they were moving the TV aerial for the big match. And like it was like, hold it there, Harold, hold it there, hold it there. and you know, you've got that image in your mind, and we all did that as well. You go, you got a cracking signal, come and sit down, and it'll be sort of misty and ghosty. It is strange now how we've gone from the wireless is the top of it's the archetypal best technology for many years. Then things go wired. And then we have like wired broadband, and then it goes wireless again, you know, and it's sort of like we seem to ebb and flow between sort of like getting a physical connection, and then all of a sudden we don't want to see that connection anymore. We want it invisible again, and it seems to go in cycles technologically, doesn't it? It's sort of, with Bluetooth.
Kind of contributes to that a bit is that, you know, people invent a technology and then it gets kind of improved and marketed to the general public as being an improvement. Often what's being improved about something is just that it's got smaller. You know, miniaturization is historically massive. The improvements in technology that are marketed to the general public are often somewhat illusory. You know, that when the manufacturers say it's new and improved, what they really mean is they found a way to make it out of cheaper components and make it a bit smaller. In some cases, by no means all, but say, for instance, with analog video equipment, often the early stuff that people don't want anymore is not only cheaper on eBay because they don't want it anymore, but is also better quality because the new improved stuff that came along later, and particularly the digital stuff, was actually really crap. You know, sometimes, not always. You know, the old technology is actually superior to the modern technology. All over Britain, there used to be these little electrical shops that would repair radios and stuff like that. And, you know, I remember going into a shop called Halcyon Electronics in Sutton in the early days. Disinformation was based in Tooting at the time, which is not that far from Sutton. And the bloke who ran the shop had a degree in astrophysics, you know. It's just like there's this extraordinary... and for instance, with the history of television engineering. I mean, television engineering, being a TV repairman is not a particularly glamorous job, but the actual level of technical skill that's required to do it is just incredible. I mean, there's this enormous body of knowledge in the community. As a cultural phenomenon, you know, the kind of knowledge of and enthusiasm for and engagement with technology and its cultural products.
Well, yeah, I think it very much is. It's sort of like if a culture didn't accept it, then it wouldn't be produced or consumed. So I think that's probably an excellent analogy for it. So, you know, where do you think your next idea is going to come from, Joe?
You know, I don't know what preoccupations you all might have, but my problem is being addicted to eBay. I've been experimenting a lot with old video equipment. Fun, so some new video projects to come along soonish.
Fantastic. Your disinformation, your choice of like a name for your projects is just increasingly appropriate, isn't it? Like, I imagine at the time you probably thought this is quite good, and then like each year that passes, you're like, I'm so glad I chose that because it's like,
it's good. It was, you're totally right. It's good also from the point of view of like I've done a lot of collaborations with other people, like filmmaker Barry Hale. Did a lot of stuff, video stuff for Disinformation, like the sort of hopefully famous, probably less famous than it ought to be, sound mirrors.
Yeah.
Barry made that. If you have a group name, even though it's not really a band as such, it's like a brand. Right?
Yeah.
So branded disinformation products. It makes it easier to collaborate with people because you're not kind of like saying, hey, I'm Joe and I'm taking credit for everybody else's work, which a lot of contemporary artists do that. They do this stuff and then you find out that actually they didn't do it. It's their mate, or their employee who did it. So it's, having a name like that is good. Originally, I sort of wanted it to be completely anonymous, and the only reason I sort of put my name on stuff was essentially for copyright reasons. And then I sort of also had the idea that other people could perform disinformation stuff, but the promoters just wouldn't accept it, get other people to do disinformation shows.
I was just thinking about it, something that just occurred to me. Is sort of like you mentioned, obviously, that you're in this world where people might want to borrow some of your work and use it as their own. I mean, have you ever sort of like had an issue with somebody using one of your samples and like putting it in a recorded track or anything like that for music?
Yeah. That has happened. Obviously, I like to get credited. So I mean, sometimes people have done it, and they've credited me, and sometimes they've not, and I've been annoyed. Unfashionably, I'm something of a believer in copyright. Crazy avant-garde experiments that nobody's interested in today are going to be the cultural mainstream of tomorrow, and that I've seen that happen in my own lifetime. If you don't try and protect your stuff, not just other people, but in fact the big corporations will profit from your ideas. So if you don't try and exercise some kind of legal control over that process, you could end up getting badly burned. Going back to some of the things you said earlier on, I took apart a calculator and I got one of those crystal earpieces from an electronics kit, and I did a version of what Kraftwerk did when they did that pocket calculator record. Put the wires from the crystal earpiece on different parts of the calculator, you could get different sounds.
Love that. Yeah. I love that though, just that I feel like it's only when you've got a stethoscope, like a toy stethoscope, or you suddenly have access to a stethoscope, that it occurs to you to listen to things in the world. Like, unless you've got something, you don't even know that you can. And then as soon as you've got something, you want to listen to everything. It's like, I've got a stethoscope. What sound does that make? And you start
used in sort of vehicle maintenance and.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Like holding it up to like a doctor of the car. But it's the same thing. And what's the other thing? Safecrackers use them, don't they? Hold them up to listening to things.
So the Foundry was this bar in Hoxton. They sort of operated as a kind of counterculture, kind of culture centre. To be a bank, and the sub-basement was a bank vault. So did this exhibit called The Noise, and I've got this book. It's a dictionary of the underworld. So it's like I can't remember the full title, but it's one of these kind of titles that's got about 30 words in it. Something like being the vocabulary of crooks, criminals, safecrackers, spivs, whatever. I unfortunately can't remember the joke very well. But anyway, the noise was a phrase it meant gelignite, really intense sound insulation in an old bank vault with a massive, heavy steel door, 12-inch thick steel door combination mechanism on it and all this kind of business. So just called it the noise because it was like old underworld slang for a stick of dynamite.
That's brilliant. I do love those little idioms that they come out with on that. It's good. But yeah, I'm sort of aware of the safes because my day job takes me into banks that are being used and disused, and there's like some of the disused banks that I go into, they've got the thick safe doors and the safe doors is left open, but it's sort of like you do worry that if that door closes behind you, are you able to get back out?
A thing at the Foundry once where a bunch of people were messing around, we would encourage people to go into the installation in pitch darkness, and it's got an amazing reverb in this underground space, got flat concrete walls. So you could put a loudspeaker in there. It wasn't a very big loudspeaker, but if you tuned the National Grid thing set up to the resonant frequency of the space, it would sort of self-amplify to a just alarming extent. So people thought there was a massive speaker in there. You'd go in there and your chest wall would be kind of shaking. We'd encourage people to go in there with musical instruments and just anything that made a noise and just kind of mess around. So it's like highly interactive. And a bit of blackout fabric slung over the corner of the door to kind of keep it pitch black inside. And then people were slamming the door shut to get the sound of the incredible sound of the door slamming shut, reverberating in the space. And this bit of blackout fabric got stuck in the door. Oh no! When somebody slammed the door shut and he couldn't open the door, and it's like, they've got whatever, 2 hours worth of oxygen.
Oh God!
In deep trouble. Fortunately, there was a bloody great, there's all this junk lying around basement of the Foundry, and we managed to find a crowbar and leave the door open before anybody noticed.
Oh, crikey. You created the world's first escape room. Where are you exhibiting at the moment then, Joe?
Well, nowhere, unfortunately. I've been pitching my work around all over the place, and I approached this big new exhibition space called Outernet Arts in Tottenham Court Road, and it's the biggest digital exhibition space in Europe, right? It's enormous, and it's well worth checking out. And I was pitching my work to I went past it one day, wrote down the details of the company that's organising it, looked them up online, worked out their email address, sent them some stuff, no response, and then just suddenly out of the blue they said, can you come and do something in 2 days' time? They calculate, I think it's the second most popular tourist attraction in the UK at the moment.
That's amazing.
So, and one of the amusing things about that was that the video I exhibited there was standard definition, 4x3, recorded on a handheld domestic camcorder. And most of the work that they're showing is kind of like 4,000 DPI or whatever.
And you're in 525.
Yeah, it closed. It was on for 5 weeks, and it closed a couple of months ago, I think. There's loads of stuff online though.
No, your YouTube channel is incredible, and it's like a whole world going. It's a bit of it's a bit of confirmation bias for me, because like I've really enjoyed like radio and sound and things like that anyway, and it's I just find the whole concept really interesting and really entertaining.
That's nice for you to say that, because in the past, the people that were actually involved in things like astrophysics and electrical engineering and stuff like that have got pretty much completely uninterested in.
I just find that the whole thing, maybe that does go back to the fact that a lot of these noises are unwelcome for a lot of people, so they just want to untune them in their own spare time. Whereas to me, and I'm sure to a lot of other people, that's like just letting your hair down, really, more than anything else, letting it flow.
there's this kind of belief that there's a sort of magic frequency. It might be, I don't know, 7 hertz or 253 hertz or something like that. There are loads of videos on YouTube about this magic frequency that's either going to kill you or give you some kind of horrible medical experience, or it's the path to enlightenment. It's the kind of secret to unlocking your stuff to do with the pineal gland or something like that. And experiencing a higher form of consciousness. And essentially, there's nothing really different. The low frequency radio and or acoustic signals, or the high frequency and or acoustic signals, that would account for the properties that people project onto them. So you can have the same, for instance, 9 hertz audio signal, and people think it's either some kind of secret meditation technique, or they think it's very harmful. But it's exactly the same thing in both cases, if you see what I mean. So a lot of the way people perceive things is to do with mindset, and to do with, to some extent, you project your own emotional reactions onto stuff. I guess perhaps the best way of putting it, and that applies to music as well.
Thanks to Joe for taking the time out to speak to me and Leila about all the projects that he's undertaken. The various extracts that were taken for this podcast in appearance order were National Grid 1996 to 99, Harry Kunzran interview, Sky TV 1999, Electric Skies Channel 4 Equinox documentary, Disinformation Stargate 1996, Disinformation Live in Moscow September 2000, Disinformation Doppelganger 2004, Sine Wave Speech Psycho Acoustics Demonstration 2022, Martlesham Heath, Language as a Meta Technology, Disinformation, Sound Mirrors, Disinformation 1997 to 2002 with Barry Hale. Go and visit the YouTube channel at C4I, that's C4EYE, and see these materials for yourself. They're certainly worth a visit. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Joe Banks. Remember, if you want to support the podcast in any way at all, you can either give it a like where you listen to it, share it, tell your friends, give it a subscription on the YouTube channel. If you feel inclined, you can also donate a Ko-fi at kofi.com/byte. You can join the conversation on the Discord, or you can @ me on X at TeleTextR. The Byte High No Limit theme tune is composed by Mr. Nisness. Byte High No Limit was presented by me, Carl Attrell, and Leila Johnston, and it is a Byte High No Limit production. And until next time, keep it blocky.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.